Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 News. Max Verstappen has fired back at suggestions that he may be leaving Red Bull in the near future, especially firing some words at David Croft after his comment in the press conference today. But there is no secret that Saudi Arabia is a critical weekend to get Red Bull back on track. They need to be better than Bahrain, there is no doubt, to keep Max at all happy within this team environment. Unfortunately for Max, there is a surprise upgrade, it seems, in Jeddah for this weekend. We expected a big upgrade in a couple of rounds of Red Bull. Turns out they'll be splitting that upgrade over the first few rounds, and that means that Saudi this weekend could be better for Red Bull than Max may have otherwise expected. How's it going to turn out when they hit the track tomorrow? Very much on Twitter your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new. A couple of topics to start the video off with. Some talk about a potential return to Africa at some point in the future. There's talk about Cape Town. There's talk, of course, about Kyalami as well. Even Rwanda as a possibility. Domenicali says the talks are not on hold, but the plans are not there yet, which kind of implies that the plans are on hold. But we'll see. Maybe the bottom line is they can get more money doing a race elsewhere, which is, at the end of the day, what it's all about. There was another bit of follow-up drama to what we've seen going on at the FIA over the last few days. So Robert Reid, here he is on the left-hand side. Effectively, he was Ben Sulayem's right-hand man. He quit the other day, and it was a big moment. And today, he actually came out with a Substack article, which I'm not going to go through everything, but he says, it's a week now since I felt compelled to resign. Of course, we talked about that a week ago. And he went on to say quite a lot of things. I thought it was interesting what he had to say here, that it's interesting but not wholly surprising that many of those messages of support came with the caveat of not being willing to say anything publicly for fear of retaliation, which highlights some of the issues that we face. And he says, I wouldn't ask anyone to put themselves in what they feel like is an uncomfortable position, etc., etc. He said quite a lot of things. There was a couple of details I wanted to hone in here, but as he says, quitting was about principles. While some progress was made on the transparency and accountability side, I ultimately found myself unable to continue within a system which no longer reflected the standards that I believe the FIA must uphold. We talked about the World Rallycross thing and the meeting associated with that a while ago. It seems like he was asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement about what occurred in that meeting. And he felt like he was given a relatively short deadline to sign it, and he wanted to seek legal advice before he did. And, you know, he didn't sign it in time for the meeting. He requested an extension, at which point not only was he denied to go to the meeting, but 10 days later, his email access was rescinded. As he says here, 10 days later, my FIA email was disabled without notice. Multiple requests for assistance and explanation went unanswered until, following a legal letter from my counsel, I was informed this was a deliberate decision. So it honestly is remarkable. He does imply at the end that he may make a bid at some point, right? I mean, as he says towards the end of this, for now it's time for holiday for the first in a very long time, but I won't be far. I remain as ever committed to motorsport and to the people who give it life. Catch you on the other side. And obviously says that he's had lots of messages of support from various member clubs around the world. So a fascinating statement really there from Robert Reid, and there has been lots of discussion as to exactly what type of pressure Ben Sulayem as president will be under very shortly, whether Sebastian Vettel could make a push to be the FIA president. Who knows what the future will bring. This weekend, though, brings the Saudi Grand Prix. This season, so far, we have had 4 Grand Prix. Each of them have been won by the pole sitter. And Saudi, 3 of the last 4 Grand Prix, there's only been 4, have been won by the pole sitter too. That should not be necessarily a massive surprise. Pole typically converts, but McLaren have been on pole the majority of the time this season. But as we discussed yesterday, that's not exactly a guarantee, I would say, this weekend. We are hoping, I would say, as a fan base, that at least if it is going to be one of the McLaren drivers winning the championship, we at least get a good battle between the pair of them. Even Zach Brown expects that. And the reality is, if McLaren are miles clear in the constructors, which it looks like they probably will be, then they are allowed to let their drivers be free to race, which I think would be good for everybody. This is interesting, though. Mark Webber, Piastri's manager, he is definitely a key piece, I think, of what's making Piastri so much stronger right now, given his experience in motorsports, racing Sebastian Vettel famously for quite a long time at Red Bull. And I'm not sure if Lando quite has anyone in his corner that, you know, really is helping Piastri or helping Lando the way that Webber is helping Piastri. And Webber says to Piastri, among many other things, I'm sure, as I say to him, you have the most experience the day you retire, so keep on learning. I think there's definitely some value in having Webber in Piastri's corner. But it is Grand Prix weekend. You guys can see that the downforce levels here are relatively lower than we might otherwise see. I mean, you can see people are talking about this little gap on the right-hand side here, right? This mini DRS. I mean, look, the reality is this is a bigger gap than other teams are running. And, you know, you can get away with this on certain rear wing designs. The drama was around if that gap flexes open more than it should on the straights, which has now apparently been clamped down on. But of course, there's always going to be some debate on the merits of that. So yeah, teams are running lower-ish downforce, and it seems like Red Bull have something special for this weekend planned as well that we will get to in a second. Before we get there, let's talk Mercedes. They should be, other than McLaren, on paper, the favourites for the weekends. Their car should go well around here. You guys might remember this time last year they had the slowest car bar one in sector 1. Their car was atrocious in the first sector around Saudi. The rear instability was causing them absolute nightmares. I think they were only faster than Alpine. This year should be a different story. There is still some concern about the electrical issues that affected Russell's Grand Prix in Bahrain because, well, they mentioned it yesterday in their debrief they did on YouTube. They talked about a lot of stuff here, Bradley Lord, and it was fascinating to hear all of the issues that Russell was dealing with. So the issues actually started about halfway through. Of course, the manual DRS situation, the brake-by-wire because it had failed. He had to manually change settings up to about 30 times over the course of the last 10 laps, of course, while battling with Leclerc, while battling with Lando. So it was, as far as Mercedes are concerned, an absolutely miraculous drive from George to get this car home in second. And it may have been a key trigger for them to say, you know what, George, whatever Max does, if he leaves, you're keeping the seat. That was at least the rumour of a couple of days ago that we discussed. But as of yesterday, they hadn't yet diagnosed what caused the issue. So maybe by today they have done, but certainly by the time they got the parts back to, Brackley, it took them a bit of time, and maybe still is, to figure out, okay, what chain of events led to that breakdown in the machine, because of course Mercedes don't want to let that happen again, but it's not like they've got long to diagnose it with the Grand Prix, well, the first session on track beginning, of course, tomorrow. Now, Mercedes have upgrades in the pipeline. They will keep things, they're calling it a common sense approach. They want to balance their development this year with their development next year, and that is a major talking point. The interesting thing for Mercedes is their engine is very likely, as it stands next year, to be the best. And let's not forget, Mercedes have 4 teams next year. It's Mercedes, it's McLaren Mercedes, it's Alpine Mercedes now, and of course it's Williams, Aston Martin going to Honda. And there is plenty of talk to this end. Mercedes, Toto Wolff is basically saying, look guys, let's not do the V10s, let's press the pause button on that, and you can understand why that might be said. This was a fascinating article here from a couple of days ago, so let me just hit the old translation here. One insider has suggested that the 2026 Merc power unit is phenomenal compared to its competitors. And this will be concerning to Ferrari, to Honda, of course, to Red Bull, to Audi, to everyone, but it does feel like, as it stands, and we get more and more articles about this by the week, that Mercedes are going to have an advantage in 2026 similar to 2014, which is scary, but maybe not massively surprising. And I guess at least this time, if it is going to be a Mercedes power unit winning the championship, it's difficult to say exactly where that power unit might come from, as in which team is going to be at the top, but it's possibly not going to be one of the others. But so one top manager, a top level executive, they learned in Bahrain, this reporter, and I'll link everything in the description as always, that they'd prefer to remain anonymous, but the chat is chilling because it outlines a technical scenario similar to the dawn of the turbo hybrid era in 2014, with Mercedes having a substantial advantage. Even this man, Domenicali, said in another discussion yesterday that there needs to be a way for teams to catch up in the next engine rules, and this is a crucial feature of the upcoming rules, that manufacturers who are falling behind, either additional resources or whatever, so that they can actually catch up. That does not sound like someone who is especially expecting it to be a real tight race from the power unit development perspective. Look, the PUs have plenty of problems with these circular regulations. We may discuss them at length again in future, but the bottom line that you've got to know for now is Mercedes are likely to be the strongest, and likely to be the strongest by quite some way. And that is a big factor in why Red Bull need to be particularly careful with the way they handle the next couple of months, especially if they want to try and keep Max Verstappen around. Who knows, maybe next year Ford, Red Bull powertrains, turn up with a sensational engine that's competing with Mercedes. I mean, maybe they find something, right? I wouldn't say it's early days, they've been developing the power units for some time, but it's maybe a bit too early to write off the championship as it stands for the following couple of years. So Red Bull, they have to make a trade-off here, and so do Mercedes, right? If Mercedes' engine is going to be rocket ship next year, then maybe you could argue they could commit more resources to this year, because next year they're going to have the great power unit and the ability to integrate that better than McLaren, because it's the first year with these new engines. Mercedes will be, slightly better positioned at least than McLaren would be to capitalize on that, one would think. So Red Bull's approach is very interesting because their primary target has to be to ensure that Verstappen doesn't go anywhere. That is the big goal. But this weekend they do have aerodynamic upgrades. They have Red Bull, so Williams do as well. They have a new beam wing, new rear bodywork modifications to reduce drag and improve airflow efficiencies. That's very interesting. But Red Bull have a revised beam wing to enhance straight line speed and a low downforce rear wing, a special one for the weekend that they are debuting. That could be a big deal. I mean, we discussed it yesterday that McLaren's big weakness, if they really have one, is their straight line speed. A little bit draggier than I'm sure they would prefer. And Red Bull historically had a really fast car in a straight line, certainly around this circuit, and it may prove critical for them to get an advantage over the final couple of sectors. Mercedes will also not be slow in a straight line. McLaren may be a little bit slower than they would like. I think the battle for pole is going to be very interesting. Whether Max can get there again, as he did in Suzuka, probably depends on a couple of factors, and also depends whether these upgrades actually work, because this is the talk. They have an upgrade for Imola. That was the big discussion that we've mentioned over the last few days on the channel. The Imola weekend was going to be the big weekend, but it seems like they're actually taking this upgrade in 3 developmental steps. The first one will arrive right here in Saudi Arabia. So they are bringing a couple of changes. The central section of the floor will be modified where it connects with the Venturi channels at the side, thus creating a different pressure management underneath the car and moving the center of aerodynamic pressure rearwards. In addition to the aero upgrades, it is also believed the mechanical packaging inside the side pods will be changed to simplify the internal fluid dynamics and also to play with the weight distribution a little bit. So that's actually a very interesting change. They may not need to admits that one to the FIA and reveal it, because if it's not aero changes, they don't necessarily have to say, but that's pretty interesting. So quite a lot happening at Red Bull. Are the changes this weekend going to make a substantial difference? Will they add up over the next 3 Grand Prix to become a competitive car? Possibly, and it's not like the championship is totally out of reach just yet. It is still very early days, but Red Bull obviously have plenty of problems that they need to get on top of. Max Verstappen said as well that if the delta on some tracks is 5/10, good luck finding that, basically, and I think that other teams would probably agree with that assessment. This, though, was a very interesting report today that Red Bull are expected to commit a lot of resources to this year's car in the 2025 fight. Now, you've also got to recognise the championship for the constructors is over, right? There's no way they're winning that. I mean, it would take something remarkable, like they would never seen before, for Red Bull to do that, especially given the historic delta and the struggle that their second driver often goes through. So that's over. It's all about the drivers for them. And the idea that they are developing aggressively, they're going to bring more updates, they're going to even compromise their 2026 project to improve this year's car, says 2 big things. Firstly, it says they're trying to maybe keep Verstappen happy by giving him a chance of a title fight. There's 2 ways to read it, though. Either they're trying to keep Max happy by making the car this year as good as possible so that he stays for the future, but obviously Max isn't an idiot. If they're sacrificing next year to do well this year, Max isn't going to be sitting there like, oh, brilliant, guys, I'm sure next year's going to be even better just because this year was great. It's like, well, actually, no, we spent all of our money on this year's car and all of our time on this year's car, so next year's cooked, right? So Max, as we will do, will see through that. The other piece is, maybe they know that next year is just chalked. Like, maybe they know that next year the power unit is not going to be good enough and their championship ambitions are dead in the water immediately. At which point, then it's like, well, who cares next year? Next year is going to be Mercedes, McLaren, one of the Mercedes power teams. We will just see where we go. And therefore, they will commit to this year to see if they can string another championship out of it when they feel that next year it's not going to happen. That is a potential conclusion that could be drawn from Red Bull committing lots of resources to this year, and I'm sure Max will think about it and mull it over in terms of what that means for his future, because look, at the end of the day, if Red Bull are going to commit so many resources to this year's car to try and get Max to win the title, and then Max says, all right, guys, I'm out the door at the end of the year anyway, then he could play it perfectly, right? He could use the massively upgraded Red Bull this year, that's their intention, to win this year's championship, and then go to Mercedes next year, or go to some other team next year that could be at a better spot. So this is where lots of the drama came from today, when Pablo Montoya says that he reckons it's the beginning of the ends for Max Verstappen at Red Bull. We even had this, let's just call it a strange suggestion from Ralf Schumacher that Max to Alpine is on the cards. I'm like, hang on a second, do you want to say that again? But I guess the argument is that they're Mercedes powered, so of the Mercedes option teams, I guess it's something you don't entirely turn down. It seems like a pretty outrageous suggestion, and I don't see a world where this happens. But I kind of see the logic, right? Like Alpine, they can clearly design a competent chassis, at least right now it seems that way. Their engine deficits is probably the big factor which is holding them back from being a real contender on some weekends. Like in Bahrain, Gasly was 3/10 off pole pretty much. So with an engine which was another few horsepower, which they are losing right now, Renault, maybe Gasly could have been front row. It's not impossible. And if you're looking for a Mercedes-powered team next year, what are you going to choose? If McLaren don't want you, if Mercedes don't want you, then, it's Alpine, isn't it? Or it's Aston Martin. Or you just stay at Red Bull. That's the option there. Aston Martin, of course, Honda-powered, but they are still maybe not leading the conversation, but they're not far away. So Max, understandably, with all the comments over the last few days, was asked the question, how's things going to go in your future? Are you going to stay at Red Bull? What's happening there? Especially because Helmut Marko is the one who keeps talking about it, right? Like, Max can get annoyed at Crofty, and maybe fair enough, but it is his own team member, Marko, who's talking all this about, we're really worried about Max leaving right now. He needs to be above a certain point in the championship, possibly in order to make sure the contract clause doesn't come into effect, these performance clauses that he has. So Red Bull have, to some degree, created the fire themselves, and Verstappen then says to Eric Van Haren, everyone's talking about my future except me. I'm focused on the car, I'm working with the team, which is a good PR response from Max. But today, it went one step further. So Crofty, of course, David Croft, the commentator for Sky Sports, he basically asked Max straight up, Helmut Marko said this, is there any truth to it? And Max kind of skirted the question and said, look, I'm just focused on this, I'm focused on that, didn't really want to answer it. So Crofty, in my opinion, good journalism, right? Like, I know that people are going to clown Crofty for this, but at the end of the day, Crofty is asking Max a question which he should be asked straight up because it's a big talking point in the media. This is the type of question that you do ask Max. Max may not like it, but Helmut Marko put it out there. So, as Crofty says, is Marko getting the wrong end of the stick? You're not thinking of leaving Red Bull, which I think for Crofty is a fair poke, right? It's a fair prod, in my opinion, right? At the end of the day, people are going to roast Crofty for coming in it this way, and I understand that, but at the end of the day, our journalism in this context is about asking good questions to get interesting answers. And that's what Crofty achieved on some level because Max then kind of roasted him in the replies.
Thinking of leaving Red Bull at any time?
No, I think just focus on commentating. I'll focus on driving. And then, you don't need to think about any other scenarios.
We just worry about you.
Even the little thumbs up he gave him at the end, I thought was, he's definitely making a point, isn't he, Max? He's definitely making a bit of a point. So what do you guys think about this whole saga, right? Max clearly wasn't too keen, and nor should he be, to answer these type of questions. But equally, if there was no doubt in Max's mind about the future, would he have responded in this way? Possibly not. So Max, of course, from the outside perspective, is going to say, look, you focus on commentating, I'll focus on driving, no other scenarios are in mind. But of course, we know that Jos Verstappen and Raymond Vermeulen and all of his team behind him, and I'm sure Max himself will at least be pondering what the future might look like away from Red Bull if this situation continues. But if the upgrades this weekend work, if the upgrades in Miami work, if the upgrades in Imola work, which is probably a bit of a push given where Red Bull currently are and their correlation issues and stuff like this, Max could still be alive, but even if he is alive in the championship fight, does he really feel like next year Red Bull is the place to be? I think Max right now is something like 13-1. The bookmakers have him in this year's Drivers' Championship, which is pretty long odds for the reigning 4-time world champion, but maybe fair on current and recent evidence, with McLaren looking as indomitable as they presently are. But all could change here in Formula One. And Aston Martin, they continue to make some noise. Andy Cowell, their team boss, said that Adrian is designing 100% of his time. It's focused on designing next year's 2026 car, which is, again, I think to some degree, a little message to Max to say, hey, your team may be committing lots of resources to this year to try and get you this year's championship, but there's one team that's focusing fully on next year. It's us. We've got, a Honda engine. We've got Newey leading the way. This is where you should come for $1 billion. That might be the Aston Martin suggestion, but there's rumours that even Honda are not going to be as well positioned as Red Bull are or as Mercedes are, for 2026 as a destination for Max to potentially leave Red Bull to go to. So fascinating stories will continue, but this weekend I think it's going to be pretty spectacular. I thought this is pretty funny as well. This is the 2025 Saudi Arabia Grand Prix, and the image they've got is Hamilton winning in 21 with the Mercedes jersey on. So, they obviously maybe made a slight error on this one. But enjoy your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.